Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about the literature, culture, and history in this snowy land that we call Canada. Every once in a while, we like to have an author on the show, and today we have an Alberta-based playwright whose works have been nominated for a Governor General's Literary Award and have won the Alberta Literary Award for Drama and the Alberta Playwriting Competition. Here to talk about her new work, or re-release of her latest work, Flight Risk, I'm happy to have Meg Braem. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, for those of you who might not be, for those of our listeners who might not be aware of what Flight Risk is, can you give a brief summary or description of this particular play?
It's a play about a young woman who's in nursing school, and she ends up sort of meeting, or she does meet, in her practicum, she meets a war vet who is about to turn 100 years old in his extended care home. And so it's their relationship and the things that they teach each other, and sort of an unlikely friendship, which is exactly what they needed at that time in their lives.
And before we get into the details of the actual play, I am interested in knowing a little bit more on your process as a theater writer or playwright, I should say, because we don't have playwrights often on the show. So I'm interested in asking a few questions about that. So, why did you decide to go and address this story through the medium of theater in particular? Like, because mediums are not random, right? They each have their own particular styles and their own particular meanings associated to them. So, what drew you to the medium of theater for this particular story?
My background is as an actor, and so I started as an actor and then went into playwriting. So really, it's the medium I work in most of the time. And I think this goes across all genres, a good story. And I think it plays really well having the voices of those characters and their perspectives speak for themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the interesting parts of the play is that, as I mentioned in the questions I sent to you, despite the fact that theater can be a visual medium, it is also one that's very reliant on dialogue, right? And I think your ability to convey so much emotion and such interesting characters through that dialogue is definitely one of the strengths of this particular play. And I'm wondering if you had anything to say or any particular insight about your use of dialogue or the way in which you think about the story through dialogue.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like when I read your question, that not everybody knows that theater relies on dialogue more than visuals. And so it is,
Right.
because it is an oral medium and it's a visual medium. But, uh, when I teach university, I teach Shakespeare, and I always talk about how Shakespeare, they would say, I'm going to hear a play. And so in
Mhm.
film, and now I'm starting to work in film, and I'm like, oh, wow, it is almost no dialogue. So it is, it feels like a natural progression, but it isn't. For me, I love words, I love language. And so it's the right medium for me, but we have a chance to see these characters speak for themselves. We have a chance to see how they communicate in the world. They're all speaking the same language, but we don't speak the same language because we speak from our perspective and we have our own character voices and our way of articulating things. And so this young character who's a nurse, who's in her 20s, and this man who's 99 years old, they have a different language, and they have to sort of kind of find their way in order to, they have to, at first it's very clunky, and then how they then sort of jam, and they can speak more honestly with each other than with anyone else in their lives because they have no baggage and they're free.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you were talking a little bit about the production of the play before we started recording. And relating to that a little bit, this is just a question I thought of right now. When you're writing a play like this, do you ever find yourself imagining how it's going to that's not a, I'm going to cut this question out. Never mind.
No, I think
I, as a,
I think I know where you're going, and I think it's a good one. If I know
no,
are
go
you
ahead. Where do you think
like
I'm going?
are you thinking of do I ever see how it's going to be staged?
Yes, but I was wondering specifically in relation to the dialogue, right? Like because we don't express things the same way as it's written, right? So like how does that whole process happen? But as I'm realizing, as I was saying the question, I was like, well, yeah, you're a professional playwright. I'm sure you do that. So I kind of
Yeah, but
lost
it's a huge
confidence in my own question.
I don't think you should though, because you have to lift it off the page because you're there
Mm,
writing, and I start when I start writing, I start writing monologues because I need to be able to sit, which is why I think acting, coming from an acting background, is so great to become a playwright because you know what it's like to sit into a role. But when I'm a playwright, I'm playing every single role. But then when you go into a workshop, and workshops are integral because it's the chance to see it off the page, because some things play on the page, but they don't play audibly. And so great actors are amazing and they help, but they can also help in the way that, a really great actor can make your stuff seem great when it's not. Um, but then also it can really, there's a certain kind of actor that knows how to help in a workshop so that you can go,
mm,
oh, I thought that worked. It doesn't work. Chris Hunt has been with this play since the beginning. And I remember we were having a discussion and he's like, this line doesn't work. And to me, I was like, really? It doesn't? He's like, no, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't flow. And then listening to him do both, I was like, oh, yeah, you're right, because you're sitting in it. Yeah. So it has to be workshopped.
absolutely. I was, I when you were talking about Shakespeare and teaching Shakespeare, I recently realized this as well because I also recently taught Hamlet in a class I was giving, and there was an interesting video that I showed my students where um, where there's some thespians who were talking about the original pronunciation Shakespeare and how even though it's not written on the page, because of course pronunciation is not necessarily spelled out, it's the kind of thing that is conveyed through acting, and that the pronunciation completely changes the acting and how the meanings of certain words um, are expressed and understood. And yeah, I was
And the
just trying to create a
punctuation.
link between what you were saying and the
Yeah.
Shakespeare thing. But yeah,
Just that punctuation is as important as the words because you are scoring music. And so your actor, some people, I think punctuation, some as far as like stage directions, some directors cut out all the stage directions. I'm not a huge fan of that, but or some people have stage directions that are so metaphorical that,
mm,
if you looked at them literally, you're like, what do you mean I cry a tsunami? Like, how am I going to do that on stage? But it's, to give a director license to make that happen.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, you're dealing with scoring music, and it's a collaborative art form. It is, you are only building a foundation for other people's work.
Absolutely.
I
Getting
mean,
into the,
only you
oh,
are,
sorry,
that's what you're doing. I was going to just say it's not that you're only building a foundation, but you are the foundation. You are not the end.
makes sense. Um, Getting into a little bit of the core of the play in this case, obviously the subject matter is quite poignant, both for actually for both main characters. And I was wondering like, what exactly you were hoping to achieve as far as reactions or considerations from this work. What were you hoping to elicit from your audience in that respect with such a hard hitting subject matter as death and illness as
I don't think I had an expectation, or I don't think there was one thing I was going for the audience. Like, I wrote the play I needed at that time in my life. I needed to talk about things. I just dealt with like a huge death, and my father had just died. I got very, very sick, and I felt like, there was and I had a best friend who had died very, within a couple of years, and there was this sort of culture um, of like optimism that was so oppressive, and I was like, no, I just want to. And that's what he does to her, is he says, like, he lets her mourn, he lets her be free, he lets her be sad. And so I think, and that was a few, I mean, like that was about 10 years ago that I was going through that. I feel like now there's a lot more things, with as far as cancer patients and, not needing them, not kind, there's this sort of victim blaming in seeing that we even have, and it's weird because I use this analogy as part of the narrative, but this idea of like, they won the battle with cancer, or they lost the battle, which is ultimately blaming someone for like they had any control. And I understand why we do it. And I think we try to make sense of the world, but I think I really needed to be in a place of like, we don't have any control. And maybe things happen. And so I don't think of course, I always write thinking of an audience, but I needed to be in that space. And I felt like people weren't talking about mortality in that way.
Yeah, I totally get that. As someone who's in contact or in close encounters with a family member who's dealing with invisible illnesses, as you deal with in this particular play, it, yeah, I could definitely see those connections that you're talking about of, you know, trying to control these things like we control everything else, which is of course desirable when you're dealing with illnesses. You don't want to just be left to your own devices. That can be very traumatizing. And so, but at the same
Traumatizing
time,
and
there's
freeing and freeing.
exactly, that's what I was just gonna say. Like there is a freedom in, it seems, in kind of letting go and realizing there are some things that you cannot control. But yeah, I think you deal with that in a very interesting way with the war parallels and so on. But yeah, just wanted to mention that. That's awesome. Um, Speaking of personal experiences, so you bring that up in the foreword to this book, that you inspired yourself from real life events and the pandemic and all of these events coalescing together. But you also based yourself off of interviews with veterans in Alberta's senior homes and the nurses who took care of them. So I'm just wondering a bit more concretely how adapting all of these real life processes and experiences, both on a personal level and in talking to other people, comes together in a way that's manageable, right? What's your process for adapting real life,
Mm.
especially for something so poignant?
Well, I think like when I first started, I didn't know it was going to be a war play, but I
Mm,
knew I was going to talk about mortality. And then I started to speak with people in extended care homes. And then I just happened to meet many vets. And, I was like, oh, I kind of want to ask, but I don't know if I should ask. But people were so willing to talk. And that's been my
yeah.
experience of especially older people. Like after I wrote this play, I worked with a company in Edmonton called the Jerry Actors. And we just wrote plays based on their memories. And it was so great because people were like, I never get to talk about this. And I started to be like, there's like incredible richness. And then so it was recording, and then sort of once you kind of say like, this is what I'm interested in, people come. Like I had somebody's war diaries. I got somebody's firsthand war diaries who was in Bomber Command, who was a tail gunner, and it was his journals. And so I got to read firsthand material of what it was like. And then when uh, I went to the Bomber Command Museum in Nanton, and they had a Lancaster, and they were doing a run up, and I wasn't sure I was going to write about, you know, Bomber Command, but I was there, and then I got to meet this veteran named Bob Peterson, and he was super nice, and I was like totally fangirling him. I was also the only woman. I think I was a total outlier because it was all these military historian guys, and I was like, what was it like? And he was like, it was cold. That was his first thing he said to me. He's like, it was cold. And then I went home and I started to research him and then hear a little bit about his story. And then it became this sort of like incredible amount of source material, and then going, what are the common themes? What are the things that could happen? And so there's a term uh, in creativity called creativity studies of like conceptual blending, of taking things that are not seen necessarily as connected and going like, what could be the connection? And so because I was like, oh, I love that story, and this was my initial impulse, and then going like, what could come out of both of those things, and then really starting to build from those stories.
Interesting. And I had planned this question later, but I feel like it makes sense here. In talking to all of these veterans and writing a story that kind of channels a lot of their experiences into uh, a play, right? Did that have an impact on your view of World War II in general, right? Because we do have a lot of assumptions about the war, especially in the Canadian context. I feel we have particular assumptions about it. And you and I are both from a generation who would have lived after World War II, of course. But
Mhm.
like, how did this alter or change your view of World War II as a phenomenon, if at all?
Well, I think I was so naive that it's not that it
Mm,
changed my opinion because I don't think I had much of an opinion. But it was interesting. There, our very first reading, somebody said like, "Well, are you worried that you're talking about bomber command? They were dropping bombs on like people, were dying and blah, blah, and it was this thing. And there's historical. There was a show, there was a documentary that came out that was sort of about taking people from the Canadian Bomber Command and like letting them meet the people who they had victimized, and what was that, and it was panned. um and I think the thing that I learned is like it's really easy to judge a situation when you've never grown up in a conflict. When you are, it's really easy to be like, how dare these people. But when you're sitting in that situation and you're like, it is so, the stakes are so high and this is what's happening and this is retaliation. I didn't judge them. I just listened. And I listened to the people's stories as humans. These guys were so young. They're so young. Like when I wrote, I can't even remember, I think I was in my early 30s when I wrote this play. They were like 19. And so when I was 19, like I don't know, it was not doing anything of any importance. Like, I don't think I could write a check. Like, there's just so many things that I'm like, it's just, I just can't believe how incredible this experience of these men who were so young. So yeah, I really didn't, I know it's not to say that my ignorance helped me, but I certainly had no bias against it.
yeah, which can be a help. Like I would say so. Like you, there's a trope in literature or literary studies of you write what you know, right? But there is something rather freeing of delving into something that you're completely unknown to, right? And it kind of removes any kind of restrictions for good or bad in that sense.
Yeah, and
I
I
don't know if that makes
remember,
sense.
yeah, I think it does. And I remember saying once, like, oh, I write what I know. And my friend was like, well, I write what I want to know. And I was like, oh, I think I'm so dumb for not doing that. But then I was like, no, because the story is the commonality between two people who have such like completely opposing experiences, and seeing that they're dealing with the same thing, which is being mortal, which is looking at life or death situations. And so it is actually a love story, not a like in a sort of it's a paternal, it's a buddy love story between two people. So yeah, I think I knew what I did know was dread and fear. And then I looked at this situation and I thought, God, like, can you imagine being 18 years old and, being going out and training and with this men and that, and there's a part in the play where, they reference eggs, because when you would do a mission, you'd come back and you get one fresh egg rather than a powdered egg. And that, and Hank, who is the vet, says like he is having a moment where he's getting confused between the past and the present. And he says, like there's chairs, there's empty chairs, and all those men who won't get their eggs. And that was a thing where it was sort of like they were living in real time of like losing their comrades and losing their friends and losing their crews. Um and I could feel a kinship with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you bring up that passage about eggs because I have it open right here in front of me. I remember that passage so vividly, in part because of what you just said, but also the moment that comes right after, where Sarah, the nurse, asks him, "Well, let's take a break. You look tired." And Hank responds, I'm tired of it all. People die in here and no one wants to talk about it. Sarah,
Mhm.
you're not dying. You're going to turn 100. That's not my accomplishment. It's the doctor's, it's Kathleen's, it's yours. I'd wish you'd let me go. And it was it was such a interesting moment, I feel, because again, while it's not explicitly said, it comes back to what you were talking about just before of the commonalities that slowly these two are trying or are coming to develop. Right? And I thought that was such an interesting way of bringing it about, right? These personal combats that both of them are facing with each of their so-called invisible illnesses, but still managing to form some kind of, small as it may be, community over that.
Mhm.
I don't know
Mhm.
if you had anything more to say about that, but I thought that was like a really interesting point of these two cooperating.
Yeah, I just think aging in our society is a really weird thing. Like we're not really equipped for it. We don't really respect it. We like really
No.
shuffle people off into warehouses. And all the stuff that came out during the pandemic of how vulnerable people are and how they're being mistreated. But that, like, I don't believe that's actually changed. There's certainly, there was a quick moment of like, oh, we're going to make sure this is better and this is better. I mean, those would be huge, huge systems that would have to change. And, I've had a few friends that have, dealt with their parents dying or dealt with, relatives dying, and the people that are elderly saying like, I don't want to do this, or like, so that becomes an interesting thing of like letting people letting people go, or letting like supporting them and supporting their choice, which of course, we have made, and it's come a long way, but it's still very complicated, still very fraught. And it should be complicated, it's a big choice. But I was also interested in that idea of people starting to have everything decided for them.
Yeah. And as I was reading, there's something about the distance of death as well, in both a literal and metaphorical sense, right? Especially as it pertains to war, because there's a whole body of critical literature about how more and more in war you don't actually have to face the enemy with drones and all of that, and what kind of psychological impact this has. But in the context of World War II, that was still a thing, right? You had mechanized weapons and you could easily or more easily distance yourself from the death, right? That was happening through chemical weapons. Oh, the enemy is all the way on the other side, or however you want to
Then or
visualize
now?
it. Then at the time, right? But still, like war was nearby, obviously, because that's war. But it's interesting how, in Hank's case, the proximity of death is what he fears, right? It's no longer someone else's death or the enemy's death, but his own literal proximity to it as an almost 100-year-old that I thought was thematically very interesting. I don't know if there's anything to that in the way that you planned it out or anything like that, but I was reading and thinking of that um, as a theme. But yeah.
I don't think he's afraid to die. I think he doesn't know
Mm,
how to let go to die, but
interesting.
I think he he can't let go. It's sort of like when
Mhm.
when you read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and people have their unfinished business, and he has unfinished business. But I think for him, what's frustrating is this idea of everybody, everything is about safety. Everything is about, eating your square meals, never having a danger within your. So he's lost his sort of feeling of agency. Um, so I don't think it's necessarily that he's afraid of death, but it also was such a
Right.
huge experience in his life that people don't talk about. And that, even in, and I'm not 99, so I don't know, maybe I'll be there. But like when you're 99, you're mortal, but then there's a lot of language around it not being true. And it's sort of like, we'll do this and we'll this. And, I've had experiences in my family where people really are broken into parts. Like, let's give this emergency surgery and this, to the point where then it becomes, like, what are we doing this for? And this is actually more painful than you can prolong a life, but I don't know if you can prolong, like, what does that mean? What's the, you can prolong, someone can stay alive, but that doesn't mean they have agency or they have value, or, or value to themselves, or they want it to be. And of course, that's personal. Some people, I think, are like, I'm ready to go. And then some people really want to stay. And um, so I think for him, I think he's stuck. I think he's stuck living until he has a moment where where he does sort of finish that unfinished thing, has some kind of closure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, that's something that I experienced with my grandmother. She used to live with my parents and I when I was in there as well. But we would make a joke with her every once in a while, saying like, "Oh, you're gonna reach 100. Just see, just you're gonna make it." And she would always have the same answer of like, "Don't wish that upon me. That's
Mm,
not something." And you could see I was too young at the time to kind of register that, but just this acceptance that this was a fact of life, that one day she will just not be there and that's okay, is very interesting and resonates, I think, with what you're saying. Mm.
yeah, like my grandmother, I remember she was like, "Man, you reach a certain age, and all of your friends have already died," and she was like, "It's incredibly lonely." And so, yeah, again, so you're left, but your community is gone.
Exactly. And getting more into the writing, or I should say the structure of the play, I thought it was kind of interesting that there were no acts in Flight Risk, right? It was just divided up into scenes, which for audience members who might not be necessarily aware of it is not quite conventional as far as how theater tends to be structured and written. And I was wondering why you made that particular decision and how you feel it impacts the story or the pacing.
I wrote it for a theater company, and that's what they do. They do one acts.
Okay.
So it was
Okay.
so that was a very like practical part of it. But then also because the story is so intimate, I think you kind of get in and you live with them and then you get out. And I think, because there was a point where I was like, oh, man, I should really make this into a two act, and maybe I could. But no, I wouldn't do it for the sake of just doing it. And
Mm,
I feel like they meet and they say what they need to say and they get what they need to get. And then I have a mentor who says, like, a play is as long as it wants to be. And so I think that that's what happened with this play.
yeah. There's a even down to the dialogue in the way that they speak to each other. There's a directness, as you're saying, that makes the whole story and the character development feel like the characters say what they want, right? Because there's no time to waste, right? But at the same time, in um, in creating those minute or quick moments, you create more time for them to develop as characters. I don't know if that makes sense in the way
I
that I'm
think
saying
so.
it.
Yeah. Like
Yeah,
we always talk about in all writing, you want it to be all killer, no filler. So,
yeah,
you don't want, it shouldn't be fat for fat's sake. Yeah.
yeah. Especially for theater, right? Where you don't have the luxury to pause on your computer or your TV and like leave and go. You're just there listening to the play and you want to be immersed in it. So yeah, I think that absolutely makes sense. Um, Getting into we've been talking about death, right? As one of the major themes and symbols of this play. But another part is, of course, what we've been alluding to is the invisible illnesses. Um, Sarah has MS, right? Spoilers, I guess, for the
Mhm.
for the play. And due to age, right, Hank is suffering from memory loss. Is it ever said that it's dementia? I feel like I don't remember if it was expressly mentioned, but
No, it wasn't expressly mentioned,
no,
but he does have moments where he's like confusing the past with the present. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it
So I just kind of
becomes that thing of like, is it dementia? Is it PTSD? Is it sort of a blend of all those things? And so, yeah, he is 99 and feeling, and reflects that in some ways.
yeah. And I was wondering how you go about portraying invisible illnesses and I'm choosing the term invisible here in like, I think it's a useful term for this particular play because you rarely say it out loud. Like like we just said, like Hank, it's never said specifically that he has dementia or PTSD. It's just kind of demonstrated through the play, and the dialogue. And I was wondering, like, how you chose to represent these particular invisibilities while, of course, exposing them, as is the play's intent, I feel, in part. I don't know if this question makes sense.
I think so. So I think the thing
Mhm.
about it is that, well, first of all, you want to show, not tell. So once start to say things like this is this, or, this is what this is, then it's easy to become didactic. But they're in a very, she has MS, and but it's a very particular time where it's, there's people who have MS, and then there's an amazing artistic director who runs a theater company called Sick and Twisted, and she has MS and she's in a wheelchair and she's super open with it. But that's one part of the journey where Sarah is at, is her identity is massively in flux. And so this play is about mourning a lot of things. And for her, it's about mourning her healthy life versus this new life and being scared of what that means. And I think, she has MS, which is specific to her, but I think it's what life is just your identity shifts. It's what aging is your identity changes. I had a friend who was a martial arts guy, and
Mm.
his body, I don't know if it was particularly because of martial arts, but he had like very huge hip problems and he needed a surgery. And I remember him saying to me, he's like, oh my God, it's so brutal for my identity, because my identity was this like young, physical, able to do anything. And he's like, and I'm not. So then who am I now? And so I think that's what I was interested in talking about.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you chose MS because it is a disease that, well, you have it, develops over time, right?
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
you slowly lose certain functions, and, often MS patients end up in wheelchairs, for example. And so this idea of visibility or invisibility is again at play, but outside of the boundaries of the play, I feel, where after the play is over, that's when the true visibility of MS, at least in Sarah's case, is going to become evident. And maybe this is
Or
just me
not.
projecting,
Or
or
not,
not. It
because
can be very
MS,
much not.
because it can
Yeah,
be very benign. But it is a thing where it is, it's not a light disease, and it's not one
that's
that
true.
you get it and then you get cured. So this is now changes, um, the idea of like, yeah, as far as we have right now, we have no cure. So cancer, you can get cancer and you can be cured from cancer, and then you can sort of like have your 5 years where you're considered. But I think you always wonder, you're always nervous about it. Um, but yeah, it's that idea of, it's not a death sentence, but it's a reality check of, it's like, oh man, I'm not this. It doesn't just happen to other people.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and I think it's a very important point to highlight that it's very possible that she lives a completely healthy and normal life for the rest of her existence. I just thought on a thematic level that it could be quite interesting to imagine, right, that in this particular moment of visuality, right, this particular moment where you're seeing her life, that's when there is the invisibility of the illness itself. And I think that dichotomy is very interesting. But yeah, I that was just a
Yeah.
thought I had.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's also interesting with something like MS, because people see it in, different ways, and people see it in like such a wide range of people are like, oh my God, MS, like you are going to end up in a wheelchair. Or people are like, whenever you have MS, you could die in a car accident. You're like, Jesus, like how it's kind of like when you tell people you're a writer. Some people are like, cool. And some people are like, you're not employed. And so
Yep.
it's just like those extremes. Yeah, but it's a new reality. It's a new reality.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's
One of
like
the
living with when you're young, and I talk about this in the forward, when you people, I remember talking to somebody because I have MS, and when I talked to somebody and I was like, yeah, I have MS, and then people were so weird, and then I remember talking to one friend, I was like, oh, I feel like I'm scary now because
Mm.
we're always young, we're always healthy, we're always probably like going to do whatever cool stuff and live to an old age and be fine. But then once something like that happens, and this doesn't even have to be on a physical level, people go through divorces, people have terrible things happen in their families. Once you deviate, I mean, it's kind of the loss of innocence. And I just remember being like, oh, I carry a truth that you don't know yet.
Yeah.
And you probably don't want to, but you will. Everyone will.
No.
Not to say that you're all like gonna have something terrible, but like life is life. And then,
Yeah.
not
No, I
trying to
get it.
wish anything on anybody. Nobody
No,
gets
no,
out
for sure.
alive is basically what I'm saying here. No one
What
lives
was the
forever.
line? What was the line from The Wire? It's like nobody wins. It's just who loses more slowly, or something like. It's
So terrible.
just a
It
very
sounds,
depressing way of thinking.
I know, but the thing that's so funny, even like when people are like, oh God, this play's so sad or whatever, I'm like, or it's not. Or it's people talking about things that they need to talk about, or you know what I mean, or talking about being honest about what's going on. And um I think there's beauty in that. I remember having a moment when my dad was very sick and we're all sitting around the
Mhm.
breakfast table and eating, I don't know why we're eating pancakes and why I remember that so clearly, but it was just this moment of like, and he was telling the same stories that he'd told forever. And I remember having this moment of going, oh my God, this is actually as good as it gets.
Mm.
And it's really good. And so you
Yeah.
start to go like, wow, we're always thinking ahead and more and more. But I'm like, no, sometimes the moment with people who you're connecting with is it. That is the best.
And on a different scale, in this case, I want to talk a little bit more about critical reactions. So your this particular edition of Flight Risk contains some essays or readings of the play, and I'm wondering um, what your particular engagement with these essays was like. Did it have you reevaluate your own work and see it in new lights? Um, as a writer, is it something that you thought was particularly interesting to have your work be critically evaluated in that way, in like an academic sense? I'm curious, like what your own reaction and engagement with more academic critical evaluations was like.
I'm always interested in cross pollination because I feel
Mm.
like in the arts we're often like, you're a playwright and you're a filmmaker and you're a historian, and like
Yep.
transparently, William Pratt, who writes the sort of history of Bomber Command, he's my husband. So, and he's a historian with Parks Canada. So, the thing about him is I'll be like, I think I write this, and then he'll be like, here's 10 books, read these. So it's great. It's great for me. And so that was great because he has an insight to a world where he just has resources. So,
Mm.
and I felt like it was so important to have, he went to the Bomber Command Museum and he got the pictures that are published, the pictures of the guys, the nose art, and it just makes people go like, oh my God, true. And look at this crew, and he even, there's one picture and he's like, this is the crew, and they didn't make after this mission, and so they're happy and they're young, and they have like this picture, this pinup picture that they painted on their plane, which is also like young male energy, and then you read
For
that one
sure.
sentence and you're like, oh wow. So it's people living their lives just with, it's not like everyone, you can't live your life going like it's something terrible is going to happen. There's something vivacious about, like, despite the risks, people just doing what they're doing. I once, I worked with muscular dystrophy patients. My husband and I
Mm.
both did. And it was this interesting thing. We're super young. We had this job doing home care, and it was all these guys, and they had their own culture. Like they were all into the same movies, and they would have movie nights, or they were all into this. And it was this thing of like, you guys don't live going like, we're so hard done by. You accept what your life is and you live within it. And I think that's the same thing with these young men in Bomber Command. Like they didn't, They didn't wake up every day. And, I don't, there were, I'm sure, moments, of course, of fear, but there's also moments of life and connection and fun. And so those pictures, I think, really bring home what Hank's talking about. And it takes Hank out from being a man who's about to turn 100 to a man who is young with all of his friends.
Absolutely. Thank
And then
you
as far as
very
and then
much.
Dr. Hogan talking about his stuff too. It always like it's just so fun for me. It's so fun for me to meet new people. It was so great for Dr. Hogan to be like, and the essay's really funny because he's just like, yeah, this play Hank is really an outlier. Like people actually did really well. It's not like all war vets came back and were, of course, there was traumatic, physical, mental, of course, and that's sort of the stuff that is the most dramatic. But there were a lot of people who came back and lived really, really rich, full lives and had families and were healthy. And I think it's important to tell all sides of it.
Absolutely. And as a one of the last things that I ask writers in this case, or any guests that I have on the show, is if there's a particular section of the book that they would like to read or share to give an impression of what the book is actually like. I already read a little bit of a section, but is there anything that you wanted to read that you think is a particularly good passage as representative of flight risk?
Sure, I'll read a passage that was inspired by my by meeting Bob Peterson and his story. It's not his exact story. I've changed quite a bit of it, but sort of some of it is from that. And he really, like, meeting him was such an inspiration to delve into this story. So I will find that and read it. Okay, good to go? Okay. So this is Sarah speaking, and she's talking about what it was like to be diagnosed. And then she says, I'm fine with it. They say everything happens for a reason. And Hank says, they are lying. Somebody took over my place when the doctors looked me over. Every time my crew went up, I'd wait for the sound of the engines returning. One night I heard the Lanks coming in, some roaring, some limping, smoke billowing in the air. It had been a rough night. I walked up the steps to the control tower. More planes hobbled onto the tarmac, and I asked, Molly's legs? Molly's legs is the name. Not yet. I waited. It was cold. I was in my pajamas. Molly's legs? Still no sight. I stood and stared at the sky. The night was starting to bleed with light. I waited, shivering. Finally, one of the ground crew walked down the steps. They were done for the night. I remember he put his hand on my shoulder and said, sorry. Sorry. Can you get more Canadian? Sorry. Word. I'll never forget standing under that sky, waiting. Just seemed to go on forever. Sarah says, I don't want to be treated like a sick person. I don't want to be treated like an old person. Maybe some made their place, but England had many bars as many bars as churches, so I never had to. When Neil was growing up, I wasn't around much, and even when I wasn't there. I got stuck. I was back in a field looking at the sky. That's why you go out in the middle of the night, says Sarah. Maybe. You're waiting for your plane to come in, but it never comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that beautiful reading. Um, and the last question I always ask, what didn't I ask in this interview?
Oh, didn't
And
you
what's
ask?
the answer to that question?
I don't think I have a question that you want to ask me. I want to ask questions from you. So here's a question because I'm just so fascinated by the fact that you're doing history and literature. I went to a book launch last night of, can't remember his name, but he's written a series of books on the Franklin expedition because you're talking about English literature or Canadian literature and Canadian history. And it was so interesting to sit there because it was interesting. A war vet was like, you know, we don't tell Canadian war stories. And he was just so pleased that this guy was talking about Canadian history and talking about the Northwest Passage. My
Mhm.
husband would say that's actually not Canadian history, blah, 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 whatever. He's a historian. He knows all the facts. Um, but but here's my story for you. Where do you feel? Oh, and this writer was like, I don't think we're telling Canadian stories. And he talked about the craft of stories. And he's like, I don't think we're telling
Mm.
Canadian stories predominantly historical stories. But for you and where you sit, do you think we are? Because I was sitting there and I'm like, I don't know if that's true. But it was interesting to listen to that perspective.
Well, yeah, it's kind of interesting. I would say we do, but not as much in the 21st century, right? My answer would be kind of to say that most stories are impregnated with some form of history, right? The context of them, the particular author's ideas about how a story is told, that can be a form of history. But explicitly historical based stories, I think there was a big moment in the 70s, 80s when we did tell those stories. You can look to Timothy Findley as a really great example of that. Rudy Weeb wrote a lot of really interesting
Yeah.
stories that are based in Canadian history and the Franklin expedition, so I guess British history as well. But but no, so I think it's really interesting, and I think the fact that we've kind of not done that as much in the 21st century is rather indicative of how Canada as a country and nation is changing in the era of multiculturalism, of official multiculturalism, right? Where it's more and more difficult to claim that there is such a thing as Canadian history. And you can claim that for a lot of countries, but in the context of Canada in particular, considering its history of official multiculturalism, I think is particularly salient or visible. And
Mhm.
I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it opens up to a diversity of stories and histories that all coalesce in this weird hodgepodge that we call Canada.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know if that answer is satisfying in any
Well, no,
way.
I think it's really satisfying because really then, when people think there's no like Canadian history, whether it's like historical fiction or not, but
Mhm.
the fact that we have, in theater now we have so much indigenous theater being put on the main stages, and that is Canadian.
Yes.
So, and we don't talk about it that way, but of course it is. So I think that, yeah, I think that's a great answer.
Well, any other questions?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I could have like minutes, but
For
yeah.
sure. Um, but yeah, thank you very much for doing this. And the book is already out, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yep. Yep.
Awesome. And I assume people can get it in most bookstores. It's available anywhere. Support
I
your
don't know
local
if it is.
bookstore, I
Yeah,
guess.
I think so. But also, you can always order it from the University of Calgary. You can order it from the U of C Press, and that's probably the most direct way to get it.
Absolutely. All right. As usual, I always put links in the description if people want to find that book, which I highly recommend. It had me tearing up at the end, and that's a rare feat.
Glad we broke you.
Exactly. But honestly, thank you very much. And I look forward to the next piece of literature that you put out.
Great. Thank you. It was great to talk to you.